Nuclear weapons, deterrent or danger?
We have to eliminate nuclear weapons before they eliminate us.
Nuclear weapons, for all their faults, for all the dangers, have helped keep the peace.
The world is divided over nuclear weapons. North Korea keeps provoking the world with nuclear and missile tests. U.S. President Donald Trump reverses course from his predecessor and suggests he favors a nuclear buildup. Russia is also strengthening its reliance on the nuclear threat. There are reportedly 9 countries in the so-called nuclear club with a combined 15,000 weapons. Meanwhile, the United Nations has just adopted the first legally binding treaty to ban nuclear weapons. It won support from 122 countries. But the U.S. and other nuclear nations refuse to take part in the drafting of the treaty. Japan and others under the nuclear umbrella also declined to join in.
You can't prohibit nuclear weapons and at the same time be part of a relationship in which you are relying on the nuclear weapon states.
We need to have partners, including nuclear possessor states, that want to work towards the elimination.
The United Nations ban on nuclear weapons highlighted the major gap between non-nuclear weapon states who signed the treaty and nuclear weapon states with their allies who chose not to join the negotiation. How then should the international community deal with the future of nuclear weapons? Our panel of leading experts here in New York will discuss deeply into this question. Welcome to the Global Agenda by the NHK World. And we're happy to have distinguished panelists. They are all the experts of the nuclear weapons. I would like to first asking Ambassador Heinotzi, because you've been the long advocate and performed the great leadership of this initiative. And could you tell us the significance of this treaty? And could you also address the criticism that the treaty might not be effective without the participation of the nuclear weapon states? How will you respond to that?
It was quite striking that while other classes of weapons of mass destruction have been prohibited, like biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons have not so far been prohibited. Even so, they are the most deadly, most horrendous weapons. So therefore, it is only logical that finally there is a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, nuclear weapons possessors have not participated in the negotiations, but in the treaty there is a pathway for them to join. And of course, it's for them to take a decision that they want to get rid of the nuclear weapons. This will not happen tomorrow. But on the other hand, when we take similar treaties, no treaty started with universality.
Great. And Mr. Weber, you've served as Assistant Secretary for Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs under the Obama administrations. And how do you explain about the U.S. administration position on this?
I think these 122 countries standing up and voting for a prohibition on nuclear weapons sends a strong, very strong signal to those countries like the United States, the Russian Federation, that still possess nuclear weapons, that we need to get moving on our disarmament obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
In your perspective, Mr. Weber, there will be some point in the future that the United States might be participating in those processes or not?
Oh, I foresee that.
What will be the condition?
We need to have partners, including nuclear possessor states, that want to work towards the elimination of these weapons, and not just bilaterally with the United States and Russia, but all of the countries that possess nuclear weapons. And this way we can achieve that ultimate vision that vision is like the summit of a mountaintop, and it's clouded in and we can't see it. But how do you summit? You establish base camps along the way, and I think we need to do that, and that's why we favor this step-by-step approach.
Right. Okay, and Dr. Lever, how do you see the argument of the legally binding the nuclear weapons? Would that make no sense at all from your perspective?
In my view, it's completely irrelevant. A nuclear prohibition treaty, the good news is that it's just not going to happen in practical sense. And it's good news because I wouldn't want to live in a world without nuclear weapons unless international politics had been fundamentally transformed into a world in which nation states didn't have to look out for their own interests and defend themselves against the more powerful. We've had nuclear weapons for over 70 years. The last great power conventional war was over 70 years ago, and that's not a coincidence. Nuclear weapons, for all their faults, for all the dangers, have helped keep the peace. And I personally, and many others, would not want to return to a world that was safe again for conventional war, of the likes we saw in World War II and World War I, and a long, long, long list of wars that preceded 1945.
I'd like to turn to Lukasz. You from Poland. From the European perspective, how do you see the current process taking place in UN about the disarmament and also the treaty for the prohibition of the nuclear weapons?
Well, Poland, just like Japan, is one of the countries that decided to stay out of this negotiations. I would say our instincts are with a world in which there are less nuclear weapons and ultimately no nuclear weapons, and we think that would be a world worth living. At the same time, we are not convinced that the approach which the ban treaty movement took is the right one. Not only the nuclear weapon states are not there, also a group of countries which are explicitly or implicitly part of the extended nuclear deterrence relationship. With the United States, in Europe we're talking about the NATO alliance, in Asia we're talking about bilateral relations. Also importantly, some of Russia's allies decided to stay out because they are also covered by the kind of nuclear umbrella. And for these countries, you can't be in two places at the same time. You can't prohibit nuclear weapons and at the same time be part of a relationship in which you are relying on the nuclear weapon states for your protection. So that's a basic paradox which cannot, I'm afraid, be bridged.
Ambassador, how did you see the position of the Japanese government?
Well, let me start by stressing that Hibakusha's, their testimony, they were very important in the whole process. And I think they're really the living proof why nuclear weapons should be eliminated. It's interesting to see that Japan came to the negotiations at the start, gave a speech, explained the problems they see for themselves, and then they didn't take part anymore. So we will see how the Japanese position will evolve over the next years, and certainly we always will respect the position.
Ambassador, were you personally disappointed by Japanese government?
Well, it would not be very professional of me to get too much emotional about those things. But what I've seen is that quite a number of Japanese people, they saw it that way, as you just expressed.
Dr. Lever, you may have alternative perspective.
Well, I think it's sensible for them not to sign on, and at this point in time, my understanding of the ban treaty is that it basically would make it illegal or prohibit countries like Japan from benefiting from a nuclear umbrella. And so effectively what Japan would be doing would be deciding to end the nuclear umbrella if in fact it were to be a signatory and abide by the terms of this treaty. And that's a debate It's not much of a debate in Japan, but everyone knows the elephant in the room is, should Japan, as the first victim and the only victim of nuclear war, if the nuclear umbrella went away, would Japan have to build nuclear weapons of its own to protect itself against China or North Korea? And the point here is simply that there's no way to make policy by signing on to a treaty that then drives your own nuclear policy. That's a debate that needs to happen in Japan among Japanese people and among the policymakers, a decision about Japan's future when it comes to nuclear weapons and deterrence. And then you can pursue treaty objectives and things like that, which is the end of the nuclear umbrella.
I would like to echo Keir's argument that they are real-life consequences of supporting or non-supporting this treaty. For the countries that are covered by nuclear umbrellas, this is the end of this relationship. So I think it would be highly problematic if a country like Japan participated and signed the treaty. As somebody from Poland that is in a similar position when it comes to NATO extended deterrence, I got sympathy for the dilemma of the Japanese government. And I think that increases right now the responsibilities of countries like Japan, like Poland, to try to find this middle ground, somehow mythical middle ground, some people are saying, between the proponents of the treaty and the countries that are saying the time is not there yet.
Eight years ago, U.S. President Barack Obama gave a speech in Prague laying out his vision of a nuclear-free world.
So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
And he followed through with action. A year later, the U.S. signed a treaty with Russia called New START. They agreed to cap the number of strategic nuclear warheads they were deploying at 1,550 each. But ties between the two nations worsened, and there's been little progress in disarmament. Then Donald Trump took office and announced he wants to bolster his country's nuclear capabilities.
It would be wonderful. A dream would be that no country would have nukes. But if countries are going to have nukes, we're going to be at the top of the pack.
Well, I think we will discuss about what would be the plausible future course for managing the nuclear weapons, whether we are really going ahead to the right path towards the world without nuclear weapons, or as Professor Lever mentioned, it may be that goal has to be re-examined as well.
Well, I think the fundamental difference is, do we want to have a safe world without the risks of nuclear weapons or not? And the risks are manifold. It's not only that the intentional use is a possibility, but we have seen so many incidents over the years. And today there are new dangers, cyber attacks, and for example, that nuclear weapons would fall into the hands of terrorists. I think that's frightening. So the only way to make sure that our children will live and our grandchildren is, of course, to get rid of nuclear weapons. Because the effects, they don't know any borders. And there are so many new studies where you see the tremendous effects, even of a very limited nuclear weapons exchange. So therefore, actually, there is no alternative if you want to have a future, if you want to have this planet to have a future, than to find a way to eliminate nuclear weapons. There was always the concept that we need a legally binding prohibition of nuclear weapons, because otherwise, I mean, you certainly don't attain or maintain a world free from nuclear weapons. So some countries have told us, those that you mentioned, we like your concept, but in our view, it's a little bit early. But there's never the right moment, because when there's a lot of tensions, then certainly the probability that nuclear weapons could be used is higher. And in my view, then we really have to push for it, that there's progress in nuclear disarmament and that they're prohibited. So I think it's not something that will resolve with a click all problems, but it was necessary in the nuclear disarmament architecture, and it's something on which we can build. And further things, of course, very concrete things, have to follow.
Can I jump in on this?
Of course.
Just, I think there's one debate about whether or not a world free of nuclear weapons is likely to be a more peaceful world than one in which we live with nuclear weapons. I think we have a fundamental disagreement about that. I think history is on my side, the evidence is on my side, because we've had most of human history was filled with warfare and conflict, and then all of a sudden great powers got nuclear weapons, and we haven't had a great power war since then. It's powerful evidence, whether or not you believe that the future can hold or not.
I think we should look to the realities of today, and this debate will stay with us. I think certainly the world would be safer when the security is not based on mutual destruction, but on a rather plausible and more cooperative scenario. And certainly nuclear weapons have not stopped wars. We have seen it even for the US. The US has been in the Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq, and so on. And the idea that big powers would constantly fight each other, I think when you look back in history, that was not the case. I mean, the 19th, 20th century was quite an unfortunate period in history with a lot of senseless human suffering.
I mean, going back to the arguments about incidents, accidents, and insecurities, personally, I don't disagree with that. I think that the argument that the nuclear weapon states are sometimes saying that it's all under control, it's all taken care of, nothing to worry about, does not really stand to scrutiny, because throughout history, including the Cold War, including the recent years, we've seen lapses in security, we've seen lapses in personnel. But the problem which I have is with this 0-1 logic, that it's either complete safety, and here you need to get rid of nuclear weapons, or it's a world almost at the brink of the disaster, which is now. I think there are stages in between, and we can work with nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons can work themselves to actually get us closer to a more safer environment than we are in right now.
Now we have a Trump administration in the United States, and the President Trump has commissioned to reorganize the nuclear posture regime.